Indigenous Language Proficiency Assessments, Implications for Canadian Postsecondary Education. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. Hello everyone, my name is Pamela Labonte. I am a research assistant here at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Education and Department of Secondary Education. I know most of us wear many hats in our lives, and I'm not unlike most. In this space and in other areas of my life, I am a researcher, a language reclamation specialist, and a language advocate. I completed a Bachelor of Arts with a linguistics major at the University of Regina and a Master of Science in Linguistics from the University of Alberta. It was at the U of R where I developed a profound appreciation for Indigenous languages, specifically pertaining to language reclamation and revitalization. I credit at least the beginning part of my story to my professors there, who specialized in field linguistics at the time. Their commitment around their work was infectious. Their stories of being in the field and working with people and working with language, everything about it was fascinating to me. The field of linguistics itself and looking at language in this analytical way and picking it apart, it is so different from how most would consider language, and it truly changed the way of how I looked at language. It was life-changing, and it's one of those things that you feel deep inside. It's a knowing that this is what I want to do. In 2003, while I was a student there, I additionally had the honor of witnessing the opening of the First Nations University of Canada, which originated from the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, or SIFC, which is what it was called when I first started my studies. This was a milestone. We all knew it. But I don't know if I really realized then, compared to what I know now, about the historic significance of what that opening represented and represents. Regardless, it was a monumental and memorable time to be there and to be a part of that history in some very small way, even if it was just as a spectator. Fast forward a few years through the twists and turns of life that led me to my master's degree. It was here at the U of A that I was provided the highest levels of support and opportunity to foster the foundations from my time as an undergraduate and to pursue specialization in the area of field linguistics with equally dedicated professors and mentors to guide me. It was my time as a grad student in the program that I began to discover and really understand the dark history behind why Indigenous languages are endangered, or in some cases extinct, and why there is even a need for revitalization in the first place. Raised in a small Saskatchewan rural community, this history wasn't talked about, and we didn't learn this history in school. It wasn't a part of the story told. My experience as a grad student changed me to the core. I have so much respect for those who provided me and continue to provide me mentorship and guidance from both the Linguistics Department and the Faculty of Secondary Education. Not just through theoretical background teachings, but for mentoring me and giving me hands-on learning opportunities that align with my skills, my interests, my natural talents, and for the opportunity to work in this space with amazing people, both at the university and in community, working with people with a shared vision. I am beyond grateful for the exposure I was given that allowed me to extend my student life outside of the 4 classroom walls that led me to where I am today. My area of expertise resides where linguistics and education intersect as it pertains to Indigenous language reclamation and programming initiatives. As a reclamation specialist, I approach reclamation through the practices of both disciplines. I approach reclamation from a holistic manner that honors and respects how Indigenous knowledge, worldviews, and culture are embedded within the language. I apply best practices in realistic and pragmatic ways that align with the worldviews specific to a nation's speaking communities. My personal mandate is simple. It is to create a space through language initiatives and programming that cultivate an environment to develop language proficiencies. I always feel like this work chose me just as much as I chose it, and I feel grateful and honored every day to have the opportunity to work in this space and to have people work with me. In addition to myself, I would like to acknowledge 2 other contributors to this research and to this presentation. Dr. Florence Glanfield wears a multitude of hats at the university. She is Vice Provost of Indigenous Programming and Research, in addition to being a professor in the Department of Secondary Education. And Susanna Lynn, our 3rd contributor, who was the project manager of Indigenous Languages Teacher Development Projects, ILTDP for short, for which this research today was supported and funded by. In response to the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's TRC's calls to action in the summary report, many Canadian post-secondary institutions have taken two active measures toward reconciliation. Equipped with recommendations, policymakers working from within institutions have the capacity to disrupt the status quo of institutional policies that tend to privilege westernized or Eurocentric philosophies by responding to calls to action. However, despite reconciliatory steps, post-secondary institutions have been criticized for not implementing meaningful or substantive changes. In many instances, this is due to a lack of defined understanding of how recommended calls to action should be implemented in a meaningful way, and an inconsistency in the definition and interpretation of what indigenization means in education. Oftentimes, indigenization in this context is interpreted from within a systemic environment stemming from westernized perspectives and traditions that were historically invested in Indigenous erasure and marginalization. Gaudry and Lawrence assert that in post-secondary education contexts, indigenization is a three-part spectrum. Part 1, Indigenous inclusion, entails incorporating Indigenous people into existing frameworks with the goal of increasing the number of Indigenous peoples within the Academy's organizational structure. The expectation is that Indigenous people adapt the Academy and its pre-existing policies and practices. Part 2 of the spectrum is called Reconciliation Indigenization and involves finding common ground between the Academy and Indigenous people. This part of the spectrum provides space for Indigenous people to inform and educate those in post-secondary institutions as to what constitutes Indigenous knowledge and then how that knowledge should be integrated and reconciled within operations. Decolonial Indigenization, Part 3, sees transformative change that includes a balancing of power. It is here that decision-making abilities are shared between Indigenous people and those in the Academy. Even so, Gaudry and Lawrence posit that despite using reconciliatory language, post-secondary institutions in Canada focus predominantly on Indigenous inclusion, this being the least substantive or transformative change that could be implemented on the three-part spectrum of indigenization. Our research was positioned in relation to the far end of the indigenization spectrum, decolonial indigenization. We were interested in researching how decision-making abilities through a balance of power could exist between Indigenous people and post-secondary institutions in relation to Indigenous language assessment practices. The calls to action that are most relevant to our objectives pertain to the topics of education, with calls 6 to 12, and language and culture, which are calls to action numbers 13 through to 17. Some post-secondary institutions have mechanisms for students to receive credit for proficiencies in languages other than English, but few lack authentic and transparent practices designed for specifically assessing Indigenous language proficiency levels. This led us to review the literature for assessment practices related to Indigenous languages. Our research objective sought to respond to two questions. Number 1, in what ways could post-secondary institutions give credit for previous language learnings in Indigenous languages? And number 2, how could an assessment tool that measures the proficiency of an Indigenous language speaker be developed and administered in a manner that respects Indigenous languages, cultures, and knowledge systems? The methodology in which the research was conducted consisted of using qualitative methods through a systematic review of literature around 3 phases of work that focused on search strategy, categorization and analysis of sources, and synthesis. The research team comprised 2 Indigenous and 2 non-Indigenous researchers from 2 disciplines, education and linguistics. This approach allowed for greater efficiencies through a multidisciplinary approach. We did not place publication date limitations on the literature collected, but were cognizant to only include research relevant to current policies and situational dynamics. Approximately 140 reference materials published between the years 1993 and 2019 were collected during the first phase. Phase 1 focused on gathering research pertaining to the research questions. The first part began with a general search of research related to language proficiency assessments. Literature consisted of academic research articles and other informative documents gathered from various governing bodies of education, such as curriculum guides, language policy, and other pedagogical practices and policies. Phase 2 consisted of 1. Organizing the literature into a centralized online shared drive that was categorized into thematic categories. 2. Reviewing the literature and identifying emerging themes found within the collected research. And then 3. Determining the relevance to the research goal. A clear divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous themes became apparent during this phase. This finding presented an opportunity to narrow our search and seek out more specific research related to comparative factors between Indigenous and non-Indigenous worldviews within the realm of language assessment practices. A significant step in the research process was revealed during our periodic group discussions in Phase 3 of the systematic review, the synthesis phase. During this last phase, the research team reevaluated each theme's significance as determined in Phase 2, identified gaps from the literature originally collected in Phase 1, and then conducted further research to supplement the gaps with additional published research and pertinent gray literature such as personal conversations, newspaper articles, and website information. As we move into the content part of the research, it's important to keep in mind the centralized theme of Indigenous language proficiency and assessment practices and the implications of the following factors. At the core, the construct of proficiency and the contributing factors that define the construct differs greatly between Indigenous and non-Indigenous languages. The main difference is that the latter does not factor in nor incorporate Indigenous knowledge or holistic elements as a measurable proficiency determinant. According to Morecambe, non-Indigenous proficiency assessment practices tend to reduce and compartmentalize knowledge rather than look at it holistically according to an Indigenous worldview. It is also important to provide a definition of Indigenous knowledge. According to Baptiste, Indigenous knowledge is a complex, holistic concept that comprises lived cultural experiences that encompass culture and language. When we look at that sentiment in regards to the context of this presentation, proficiency should be regarded and defined within the worldview specific to the target language and then assessed accordingly. In this way, the construct of proficiency is challenged according to westernized philosophies. Before assessment practices can be modified, it is essential to understand the barriers associated with developing and administering them. This presentation highlights 4 main barriers for consideration. The first 2 barriers are very closely associated with the previous information regarding intrinsically understanding the foundations of the proficiency construct. The first barrier being the misalignment between Western and Indigenous philosophies. And second, an inherent barrier is knowing how to incorporate Indigenous knowledge as a measurable assessment component. Haynes et al. State it is difficult to develop tools that are not only linguistically and culturally appropriate to the subject matter, but that also meet the demands of state and federal guidelines for educational standards. Baptiste further states that Eurocentrism is the knowledge system that is the monopoly among academies. Those within the academy need to be educated or re-educated on how Indigenous knowledge can be and should be integrated into the institution's practices, even if it's contrary to Eurocentric focused practices. These are 2 very powerful statements that illustrates the polarizing views and the challenges associated with these 2 ideologies coexisting. Another barrier that needs to be highlighted is that fluent Indigenous language-speaking populations are aging. With a limited number of remaining fluent speakers, few can guide the process of defining the target language proficiency construct and informing authentic assessment practices. Addressing this barrier requires urgent measures through strategic tactics of collaboration, while fluent speakers remain able to collaborate and guide the assessment practice. Linguistic characteristics are another barrier or challenge. Polysynthetic properties that are characteristic of many North American Indigenous languages pose another challenge that creates complications for developing reliable assessment tools in terms of assessing grammatical accuracy. especially for underdocumented languages that may not be understood at a deep level of analysis that is needed. My intent is not to turn this presentation into a linguistic lecture. What is important, though, is to know that sometimes not even experts or speakers of the language always fully understand the language's grammar, which incorporates polysynthetic properties. This needs to be considered when developing assessment practices or assessment tools and looking at what those implications are, and not comparing to non-Indigenous languages which standardly assess grammatical accuracy as an assessment component. Additionally, North American Indigenous languages are incredibly distinctive and diverse in terms of linguistic properties. This categorization means that one cannot rely on other similar languages to analyze unexplained linguistic phenomena. Also, dialect differences from within and between speaking communities of individual languages also pose barriers for measuring proficiency levels. Speakers of the same language or dialect cannot always reach a clear consensus of what it means to be proficient in a language because of differences in how they speak. This contributes to differences in opinion on what constitutes the proficiency construct of that language or dialect, and in turn has implications on the assessment practice that need considerations. Another assessment barrier is the misconception that written communication is an implicit property valued by all languages. From a westernized perspective, literacy components are often regarded as having a central role. This misconception needs to be challenged through gaining awareness that Indigenous languages traditionally do not encompass written components and are traditionally oral languages. Non-Indigenous language assessment practices standardly incorporate literary elements into the assessment's design to evaluate proficiency levels in the ability to read and write. If Indigenous language assessments were to be developed using similar methodologies to the non-Indigenous language assessment designs, the assessment practice may violate oral traditions valued by Indigenous cultures. Even when an Indigenous language or dialect has an established orthography with high associated literacy rates, there may be individual orthographic inconsistencies that have implications on the assessment approach. For instance, Navajo is an example of an Indigenous language that adopted an orthography that is now relatively standardized amongst speakers. This means it would be a safe but generalized assumption that a proficiency assessment for Navajo could include reading and writing components. But again, this will be speaker dependent, and due diligence is still required to ensure that reading and writing proficiency levels are only evaluated for those participants who are literate in the Navajo orthography. This point can also be illustrated through the decision made to officially adopt one standard Inuktitut writing system in 2019. This unified writing system is representative of all dialects spoken in the northern region of the country and replaces 9 other non-uniform writing systems which were born from the results of colonization. So that would mean there are 9 variations of the writing system to be streamlined to a point of standardization to attain the goal of high associated literacy rates using one writing system or orthography. This will likely take years before the orthography is fully implemented and accepted amongst its users. However, like Navajo, as literacy rates increase, future implications include the possibility for Inuktitut proficiency assessments to evaluate reading and writing competencies. It is crucial to end on the note that each speaking community's language dynamics need to be understood as unique. Thus, assessment practices should be determined on a case-by-case basis as to whether writing and reading competencies should be a part of the proficiency construct and subsequently the assessment practice. Despite various barriers in developing valid Indigenous language assessments, some post-secondary institutions have made concentrated efforts in remediating gaps by implementing meaningful, transformative changes through adopting holistic approaches to their assessment practices. These are the post-secondary institutions that have practices in place that position themselves on the side of the indigenization spectrum that promotes an environment of transformative change towards indigenization in education. For example, Harvard permitted one of their students to fulfill their program's language requirement based on the proficiency results of the student's first language, Coasati, an endangered Indigenous language native to the Louisiana region. Harvard enlisted the expertise of Jack B. Martin, a linguist and someone who specializes in Coasati, to develop and administer a proficiency assessment exclusively designed to measure proficiency levels for this one student in this one language. Assessment logistics important to note was that Martin resided 1,300 miles away from Harvard, and the student being assessed was in Louisiana at the assessment time. Martin made arrangements with a Coasati community elder with whom he was in contact and had a relationship with to be present with the student in Louisiana during the assessment. Together, the student and the elder used an online meeting platform with Martin during the assessment so Martin could monitor the administration. The student in this situation was literate in his native language, so the assessment comprised written and oral components. The oral part of the assessment consisted of a conversation that began with the elder asking the student basic questions in the native language and then gradually delving into more challenging subject matter. For the written portion, the student was given a text of a traditional story written in Coasati, followed by the elder orally asking questions about the narrative in the language. Once the assessment was complete, the elder spoke to Martin privately regarding the student's overall proficiency levels in a linguistic regard. Results were compiled, analyzed, and communicated back to Harvard. This exemplar illustrates how collaborative approaches can yield substantive changes from within the institution. Collaboration like this benefits not only a single student, as illustrated in this example, but it creates opportunities for other students in similar situations. Another example of a post-secondary institution that has adapted its practices is sourced from the University of Arizona. According to Natasha Warner, linguistics professor and head of the department, special accommodation is provided to develop proficiency assessments for when requests come in for Indigenous languages and assessment is not readily available to ensure the assessment is aligned with the needs of the student and particulars of the language. She explained that as linguists, they see language primarily involving spoken competence, so they don't require reading or writing necessarily, especially if the language is underdocumented and not often written in the community. Assessments are done in person at the university or via an online meeting platform for requests made by other universities. Lastly, a pioneering example is illustrated through a Memorandum of Relational Understanding, MORU, between the University of Alberta and Yellowhead Tribal College, YTC, both located in Edmonton, Alberta. YTC is the city's only First Nations post-secondary institution. The MORU details how YTC will work closely alongside elders and keepers of a language to develop an assessment process that will inform the U of A as to how to provide university credit for Indigenous language proficiency for those who wish to pursue a teaching degree without holding previous credentials or certification. Assessment tools will be developed in conjunction with elder consultation and will recognize the way cultural knowledge is embedded in Indigenous languages. A key recommendation of how post-secondary institutions can progress forward with realistic next steps first entails a collaborative approach to proficiency assessment development and implementation practices. A true collaboration between the institution and communities is the foundation of all next step recommendation. This cultivates a network of collaborators with a shared vision, and it's one that aligns with part 3 of the indigenization spectrum that I introduced at the beginning, decolonial indigenization. The partnership is one that needs to respect the First Nations principles of ownership, control, access, and possession, or OCAP, in which First Nations own, protect, and control how their information is used. This approach provides Indigenous communities greater control of language initiatives with local decision-making abilities as opposed to the institution being the dominant controlling stakeholder in the decision-making process. Next, it is crucial to be aware that not all Indigenous languages are characterized in the same linguistic regard or cultural manner. This recommendation entails acknowledging and defining the proficiency construct specific to an individual Indigenous language, rather than categorizing all Indigenous languages as a monolithic collective. This step is twofold. The first part is understanding that Indigenous languages cannot be compared to non-Indigenous languages when developing proficiency assessment tools. The second part is to recognize that each proficiency assessment cannot be developed using comparisons to other Indigenous languages or even in comparison with other dialects of the same language. Rather, proficiency should be regarded and defined within the worldview specific to the target language and then assessed accordingly. Considerations also include addressing and honoring cultural protocols within the construct of knowing who defines the construct of proficiency of the language or dialect, and informing key elements such as who administers and then evaluates the assessment. Lastly, it is advised to consult elders, language experts, and knowledge keepers to guide the assessment process in a manner that respects Indigenous laws by protecting and honoring what is appropriate to be shared in a culturally respectful manner. Engaging with local speakers such as elders and knowledge keepers also remediates the more immediate issue of working with aging fluent speakers who can contribute crucial linguistic information and cultural knowledge necessary to develop reliable and valid assessment practices. This last recommendation entails challenging the perception and definition of who is a language expert and understanding this role embodies many forms. In many instances, language experts or linguists, formally or informally trained, are situated from within the speaking community or nation, and experts from outside of the speaking community in these cases would not have to be sought out to do the work. In situations when it has been determined that expertise is needed from someone outside of the speaking community, one should follow a community-based language research model that outlines how the work is conducted in a collaborative and mutually beneficial manner. In conclusion, we are recommending to standardize the assessment process and not the assessment tool. Through our research, we believe a paradigm shift in assessment practice will contribute to radical changes to cultivate substantive and meaningful reconciliation within the institution that support TRC's calls to action. Reconciliatory efforts pertaining to education and language-specific calls to action in this context include moving towards transformational change that supports a balance of power on the indigenization spectrum that has been traditionally non-existent in current practices. The redistribution of power can be accomplished through mutual partnerships between post-secondary institutions and Indigenous communities working together towards standardizing the assessment practice by facilitating the development of culturally relevant proficiency assessments. And very important to highlight is that a prescribed assessment model based on non-Indigenous language criteria from a Eurocentric viewpoint should not be employed for informing how to measure Indigenous language proficiency. Rather, the institution's assessment practices should be informed by and inclusive of Indigenous knowledge. We believe standardizing the process of assessment practices supports TRC's calls to action by creating equitable opportunities for those who wish to assess their proficiency levels for academic purposes. We believe a deeper level of awareness and understanding for those who have the authority to implement meaningful change would better prepare them to make informed decisions on adapting current assessment practices to those that incorporate Indigenous knowledge. And lastly, we believe a significant implication for this research could be used to inform how to provide students with university credit for knowledge or proficiency of an Indigenous language. Resultant action steps would create pathways to make post-secondary education more accessible for speakers of Indigenous languages.